Shalom. Welcome to the special gathering commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day in The Hague, where we each year organize a commemorative event which we focus on the impact of the Holocaust and the development of international law. The theme which we have chosen this year is compensation, reparation, and restitution. On behalf of Hague, the cultural foundation of the Jewish community of The Hague, the Embassy of Israel, and the municipality of The Hague, I thank you for joining. The program will be opened by His Excellency Abdulkawi Ahmed Youssef, President of the International Court of Justice. He will share with us his reflections on the theme. We are very honored that President Youssef has once again agreed to represent the international law community at our event at the highest level. The City of The Hague sees its role as host to many international organizations as a very important one. It is therefore entirely appropriate that the municipality is also co-hosting this event. Our mayor, the Honorable Jan van Zanen, will share some thoughts on behalf of the City of Peace and Justice. He'll be talking to us from the Rabbi Marcinplein, the former Jewish neighborhood in the center of town. The main lecture will be delivered from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum by Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt. Ambassador Eisenstadt is a veteran diplomat, a respected attorney, and an acclaimed author. He played a historic role in bringing back on the world's agenda the need for belated justice for Holocaust survivors and families of the victims. We will then hear testimony from Miss Marion In Lewin. Together with her parents and her twin brother, Miss In Lewin survived Westerbork and Bergen-Belsen camps. Until 2001, she directed the Office of Health Policy and Programs and Fellowship at the Institute of Medicine in the National Academies in Washington, D.C. She has published several books on public health policy. Today, she shares her personal recollection of the Holocaust era. We are deeply grateful to her for this. Closing remarks will be delivered by His Excellency Naor Gilon, Ambassador of the State of Israel to the Kingdom of the Netherlands, also co-hosting this event. The various speakers will each approach the subject from a personal or legal perspective. But for a brief moment now, I would like to invite us all to look at the momentous events with which we are concerned from the lens of a Jewish mystic. In Jewish mysticism, the idea of restitution comes very close to the concept of tikkun, repairing a fractured world. This idea was introduced by Rabbi Isaac Luria and has come to play a very significant role in Jewish thinking. Tikkun teaches that when we observe a world which is fragmented and torn, even if it is not through our own doing, our task is to repair whatever we can. We're not bystanders, just spectators along the line. We are players, and our task is to make whole that which is broken. When Abraham heard of the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Moses witnessed cruelty in Egypt, or when Jeremiah experienced the destruction of Jerusalem, they cried out, they protested, and they lamented, and they knew they were making a call for action. Each cried out in his own way, in a manner that was appropriate for the situation at hand. When we witness or experience cruelty and injustice, the task of the court is to uphold justice, sometimes in the form of retribution, sometimes in the form of restoration. When we witness or experience theft and robbery, the task of law enforcement is often to restore justice in the form of restitution. Responding to something as huge and all-encompassing as the Holocaust cannot be restricted to the courts and law enforcement bodies. Societies cannot be mere bystanders. We are all players. We must counter cruelty with kindness, evil with goodness, hate with love, and repair that which is fractured. We must teach our youth to appreciate the true value of their own life and that of their fellow. Every human is created in the divine image. That is priceless. In the place of darkness, bring light. In the place of despair, bring hope and purpose.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you from the Great Hall of Justice in The Hague to this important event dedicated to the commemoration of the Holocaust. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be able to address again this commemoration. On 1 November 2005, the United Nations General Assembly designated 27 January as an annual International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. It's a day to remember and honor the millions who were exterminated because they had a different religious or ethnic origin, because they were simply the other. It's an opportunity for collective pause and reflection, an occasion to recall the unimaginable horrors of the past, an occasion to reaffirm our commitment to the outlawing of genocide and the strict observance of human rights, and ensure that similar atrocities will never happen again in the future. The theme of this year's commemoration is the compensation, reparation, and restitution for victims and survivors of the Holocaust. The general principle for reparation of internationally wrongful acts is very well known. Some 20 years before the Holocaust, the Permanent Court of International Justice held in the Chorzów factory case that reparation must, as far as possible, wipe out all the consequences of the illegal act and reestablish the situation which would, in all probability, have existed if that act had not been committed. The question is, however, how does one repair the Holocaust? How can we do whole what can never be undone? Is it really possible to undo the massacres, the persecutions, the deportations, the forced labor, the separation of families? Can we simply, to use the Permanent Court's language, wipe out the torturing, the suffering, the maiming and gassing of millions of Jews and other minorities? What about the anguish of a person about to be gassed in a furnace? I don't think that full or even adequate or fair reparation in the sense of restitution can ever be made in such circumstances. Such monstrosities cannot be undone or wiped out. It is impossible for the human mind to conceive, let alone quantify, the indignity and inhumanity inflicted upon those victims. There is no price tag for genocide. That is perhaps why, at the end of World War II, the Allied powers focused primarily on the prosecution and punishment of the Nazi officials and individuals responsible for the atrocities, massacres, and executions. However, some attempts were made at seeking compensation for Holocaust victims and survivors from Germany. Most of these compensation schemes focused on restitution or compensation for property damage. Some other schemes were also limited to gesture payments or symbolic acknowledgements of the injustices suffered. In Africa, following the genocide of the Tutsi in 1994, some attempts were made at reparations. At the national level, the government of Rwanda established a fund for neediest survivors of genocide in 1998, with some remarkable results. This was not followed at the international level, however. In 2002, the president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda urged the United Nations Security Council to provide compensation to victims, but this plea was not given effect. It is difficult to identify any general principles in international law for the reparation of victims of mass murders or genocides. But in a sense, I am glad that this is the case. To articulate precise rules for the reparation of such crimes is to put a price tag on them. This might be interpreted by powerful groups or states that if atrocities were committed, they could always be paid for. However, no reparation can ever undo this kind of inhumanities. The emphasis should therefore be on preventing such crimes. That is where we should concentrate our efforts and invest our resources. An emphasis not in words, but in action. At times we say that genocide should never happen again, but yet it happens. The genocide in the Balkans or in Rwanda are all too recent to be ignored. We must prevent another Holocaust from taking place. We cannot afford, as human beings, that kind of inhumanity in our world. Barbarism on that scale should never be visited again on human beings. I declare this remembrance event open.
Come tonight with rhymes of how the war at last died, and repeat them 100 times. Each damn time I shall cry. Lines written and translated by the Dutch-American poet Leo Vroman. Vroman was Jewish and in 1940 managed to escape the approaching evil and thus survived the war. He at least. Today, we are remembering all the people who did not survive the Nazi regime of annihilation. Today, on this day, the 27th of January, the day designated by the United Nations as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The United Nations that was set up in response to the horrors of the Second World War. Here too, in our UN city, The Hague, this past year, we marked the 75th anniversary of that organization and reflected on what has been achieved in 3/4 of a century in the field of human rights, for instance, or international criminal law, which occupies such a prominent place in my city, The Hague, as the international city of peace and justice. 80 years ago, during the Second World War, that was far from true. A regime that despised humanity was installed here at the time. More than 12,000 of The Hague's Jewish residents fell victim to that regime. Men and women, children and seniors alike. And I'm standing here by the monument that commemorates one of the greatest evils ever to befall The Hague, the murder of its Jewish citizens. At the start of the war, The Hague was home to the second largest Jewish community in our country, in the Netherlands, after Amsterdam. And by 1945, that community had been largely wiped out. Opposite where I'm standing now, there is a square named after The Hague's chief rabbi, Isaac Maarse, who was also murdered. And there's a monument on the square which commemorates the Jewish children who died. It's a most suitable place for it, because it was here that one of the schools designated by the occupiers as a Jewish school once stood. Here, the children were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, even as the classrooms were becoming more empty by the day, right until the bitter end. A handful of class photos from the Jewish primary school taken during the time still remain. From the few pictorial records we have of the persecution of Jews in The Hague, these photos are among the most heartbreaking. We don't know the names of the children in the photos and about what happened to them. We can only fear the worst. It's up to us and the future generations to keep memory of those terrible times alive, and always to strive for peace, freedom and justice. The history of Nazism and the occupation of the Netherlands just shows us how insidiously, sometimes even imperceptibly, the rule of law can be undermined, how people can be stripped of their rights one by one and relegated to second-class citizens. Even now, 75 years later, we still need to be on our guard to combat all forms of anti-Semitism. Not look away, but stand up for our fellow citizens and remain vigilant when it comes to freedom and the rule of law, both at home and further away.
The process of compensation, reparation, and restitution that we are concerned with today started almost 70 years ago. In March 1952, 3 delegations came together in the village of Wassenaar, just outside of The Hague. A delegation representing the government of West Germany under the leadership of Chancellor Adenauer, a delegation representing the government of the young state of Israel under the leadership of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and a third delegation, the Claims Conference, led by Nahum Goldman. The delegations had the task of negotiating a program of indemnification for the material damages to Jewish individuals and to the Jewish people caused by Germany during the Holocaust. Today, almost 7 decades later, we once again visit Kasteel oud Wassenaar with German historian Hanko Jurgens and Annemiek Gringold, curator of the Dutch National Holocaust Museum, and try to recapture the zeitgeist of the negotiations, to take a look back in history and to reflect on the groundbreaking work that was done by these extraordinary people.
Now, being here in this castle, knowing that here in Wassenaar, during the occupation, many of the Nazi occupiers' top stayed here, in this very Wassenaar, and also in this hotel. We know Rauter stayed here and had his dinners. We know Seyss-Inquart stayed here during occupation. So it has this very burdened history as well.
What I think is very interesting is that I knew the Luxemburger Abkommen very well, but I didn't know that the negotiations were here in Wassenaar. And that's also always the interesting discoveries you make when you're doing research in history, that you always see new angles and new perspectives, and then suddenly you discover that Wassenaar was the place where they negotiated the Luxemburger Abkommen, so to speak. Yeah.
Following the liberation, 7 years after the liberation, to designate this site as a start of repair, of compensation, of acknowledgement of the tremendous trauma that the Jewish community and the Jewish people actually suffered, gives a sense of victory perhaps, because the conference that did take place here for almost 6 months with these 3 delegations was a very important one.
But first, who were these extraordinary people who made up the delegations? The delegates were government officials, intellectuals, and legal experts. The Israeli delegation was headed by Giora Josephtal, head of the Absorption Department, and Felix Shinar, head of the special department set up by the Israeli Foreign Ministry to deal with claims against Germany. Both of them were originally from Germany. The Claims Conference delegation was headed by Saul Kagan, Executive Vice President of the Claims Conference, Moses Levitt, Vice Chairman of the Joint Distribution Committee, Nehemiah Robinson, Benjamin Ferencz, and A.L. Easterman were their legal experts. The German delegation was headed by Professor Franz Bohm and his deputy, Dr. Otto Küster.
There are 2 important people. Franz Bohm was interesting, was a professor for law and economics who really had problems with the Nazis already in the 1930s. He didn't get a job as professor, which was expected for him. And after the war, he became the chair of the Association for Christian-Jewish Dialogue, which was founded in 1949. So it was, in a way, logical that he would chair this, the German delegation. And the deputy chair was Otto Küster, who really got troubles with the Nazis. He was already fired in 1933 because he was criticizing the Nazis for anti-Semitic rules.
So this is the archive.
The boeken, the guest books, are here, and we need March 19th. The reason that we found it so quickly was here Saul Kagan's name. And I was so happy when I saw it because I realized we found it.
So actually here we see the list of the 3 delegations, the Americans, yes, the Israelis and the Germans.
Yes.
And they've all registered to be guests, yes, in this hotel. And then of course you can see there's police as well. We of course know that the atmosphere between the various delegations, between the 3 delegations, wasn't very good in the beginning. They were very suspicious one of each other.
That's correct.
So there must have been tense in the air, but there was police as well.
It was not logical that this arrangement would be ratified in 1952 by the German parliament,
yes,
and Adenauer had to depend on the Social Democrats, who supported it all wholeheartedly.
Yes. Well, also on the Israeli side, it wasn't the obvious thing to do. I think it was just a very minor majority in Knesset, in Israeli parliament, when Ben-Gurion pleaded, we have to get into negotiations with the murderers of our people. And it wasn't the obvious thing to do because there were factions in the newly born state of Israel, in the Israeli society, that the only thing they could think of was vengeance. As you said, the bomb threats to the negotiating panel of the German side, to Adenauer. There were sections in Israeli society that wanted vengeance on what happened during the Holocaust.
It was decided that there would be 2 parallel discussions, Israeli Germany in the morning and the Claims Commission Germany in the afternoon. Both were to be conducted in English. Since most of the Israeli delegation were originally from Germany, most of the Israeli-German discussions ended up being conducted in German. For a period of 6 months, these 3 delegations negotiated precariously on the subject of restitution. For the first time in the history of warfare, a country which had abused and murdered civilians, both its own citizens and those of countries it occupied, agreed to compensate the survivors. The revolutionary idea was that direct compensation was to be paid to the individual survivors and compensation to a state that did not even exist at the time of the atrocities.
It was a very important first step for 3 delegations to come together and to decide what they decided, and to come up with in the end, legislation accepted in Western Germany that also affected the Jewish community in this country. It resulted in compensation of the material goods.
Well, this was of course the guest house of the government, and one might think that in the beginning of the 1950s the Jewish and German delegation did not want to sleep in the same house, but we don't know. That might be very interesting to see.
Okay, according to the claims conference site, all 3 delegations were here.
Yes, of course they were discussing here, but
they were housed here also in a secluded area where they could slowly grow accustomed one to each other and to trust each other as well. Because that's why it took so long.
Each other? Did they have dinner with each other? I'm not sure. It could be.
What I understand is that in the early days of the conference, the members of the delegations were not left alone with each other in one single room. There were always others present, because they didn't know what the tension might bring, so their unwillingness to really enter a true transparent dialogue and negotiations.
At the beginning of the negotiations in May 1952, a serious crisis developed, and the sides left the discussions following a heated debate regarding the amount to be paid as reparations. As the conference continued through April, May, June, July, and August, the discussions between the delegates developed into a good working relationship. The delegations had met in Wassenaar day and night for months on end, and slowly personal relationships did develop. The delegations from the US and Israel had the impression that the German delegation was there to seek an agreement.
One of the things that struck me is that we have 2 delegations here. And of course the Jewish delegations, both from the US and the Claims Conference and Israel, of course represent this very traumatic part in the negotiations. They have lost virtually everything, and they're representing a people in heavy trauma. And the German delegation, which of course also didn't have the support of the entire country, but they did represent that country of perpetrators. And actually they're coming and sitting at the table negotiating compensation, repairs, was a first step to confront as a nation what responsibility of these crimes meant. It was a first step, as I see it, in a long process of healing, coming to terms with its past, taking responsibility, never to let it happen again. And I think that's what makes this conference very special and very important. It's these 2 very different groups of people, the perpetrator side during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, and the Jewish victims' representatives coming together, sitting under a roof, sharing lunch, growing trust, and negotiating how to make a better world.
Yes.
How to repair.
I think it's very important that the Germans took responsibility for that. But there are 2 sides of it, in that sense that it is certainly an initiative of the government, and it's not, perhaps not always shared by the whole society, particularly not in the beginning of the 1950s. But if you look in a long run of post-war history, this first step was of course very important. in the sense that taking responsibility for its own past is, of course, something which the Germans has done very well in the, until recently, particularly.
How must it have been for these Germans to sit at a table with these Israelis, with these people from the Claims Conference, and look them in the eye? How must it have been for them?
I think there is one important thing. Those delegates were also criticizing the German regime. So, of course, they felt very responsible for what have happened, and it was probably very difficult for them to look them in the eye. But they were not responsible themselves.
As individuals.
As individuals.
And then again, if I think of the Israeli delegates in this room, or the representatives of the Claims Conference sitting here opposite those German representatives, who as individuals perhaps are on the right side of history, but of course they represented the collective German history during World War II. Yeah. They represented the perpetrator side on the negotiating table. I think for the Israeli and for the Jewish representatives from the US, it must have been also very, very difficult to put that first step, to look them in the eye and to share with them all the damage and all the experiences and all the trauma that the Jewish people had suffered. So for both sides, it must have been tremendous, difficult walking in here and starting that dialogue.
Yes.
But on both sides, and you say because of the individuals selected to represent the German part of the negotiation, on both sides there was the eagerness that something had to be done in order to leave that history behind and start a healing process, really make repairs. Everybody in that room was convinced of that.
Saul Kagan was one of the chief negotiators from the very beginning, and he worked for the Claims Conference for over 50 years. And on the Claims Conference site, there's a wonderful film with him. It's a very old man looking back, reflecting about his experience. And he speaks specifically about this early period in 1952, when the delegations first came together. And he said that it was a very solemn occasion, that they had the feeling, the Israeli and American delegation, that they were negotiating for souls that were also with them in that room at the same time. But these people, these souls, of course, were not able to be present. And he felt that they felt the weight of these souls in the room at the time that negotiations were started.
The legislation that followed this conference, well, you could say that there was room for improvement. It wasn't the best legislation you could imagine, but it was a very important step. And we see that from then on forwards, actually all the way up to today, we are struggling with how you can compensate the suffering that was done to the Jewish people. Until today, there are disputes on looted goods being restituted to rightful heirs. Until today, there are disputes whether companies or people that to benefit from the looting, from the persecution and the deportation, where money was involved as well, if they should compensate the victims. And what you feel today started here back in 1952.
The work of the Claims Conference is still going on today. But what's the most important, I think, for me is to think that what can prejudice bring? What can prejudice and hate bring? And you can see from the negotiations and from the history behind negotiations where prejudice and hate can lead. And that's also part of the Claims Conference, that they have an educational program that deals with the education of the Holocaust for the youth. And that's, I think, one of the most important things today. From 1952 on, the work of the programs of the Claim Conference, which support Holocaust survivors, continues today. The keynote speaker of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day 2021 is Stuart Eisenstadt, who for decades has played a major role in the negotiations that have greatly expanded their original program of the Claims Conference. During the Carter administration, Stuart Eisenstadt was Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor. His recommendation to President Carter led directly to the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. In his role as Special Representative of the President and the Secretary of State on Holocaust-era issues during the Clinton administration, he successfully negotiated agreements with European banks, insurance companies, and governments, covering communal and private property restitution or compensation payment to slave and forced laborers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, recovery of looted art with 42 nations, bank accounts, and payment of insurance policies. Working with Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson, the International Holocaust Education Working Group was created, now the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, with over 30 countries to promote Holocaust education in their school systems. In 2000, he negotiated the Teresian Declaration, and in 2010, the best practices and guidelines for restitution or compensation of real, immovable property confiscated by the Nazis or their collaborators with over 40 countries. He currently serves as expert advisor to the State Department on Holocaust-era issues and special negotiator on behalf of the Jewish Claims Conference. His book, Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II, has been widely acclaimed and translated into several languages.
Privileged Rabbi Shmuel Katzman of the Rabbinate in Hague asked me to deliver these remarks in The Hague on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'm speaking from the hallowed grounds of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I helped create with President Carter, and want to especially thank the director of the museum, Sarah Bloomfield, and Diane Saltzman, the head of Constituency Affairs, for making this possible at a time of COVID-19. Since it opened in 1993, almost 50 million people have visited, 3/4 non-Jews. I speak to you at a troubling time of a rising tide of hatred against minorities and anti-Semitism, and appalling declines in knowledge about the Holocaust and its contemporary lessons, particularly by young people, as more and more of the 350,000 survivors, eyewitnesses, are leaving us. But it's also a time when there are genocides and potential genocides around the world. If we're to take seriously the pledge Never Again, we must apply the lessons of the Holocaust to contemporary 21st century challenges. There was nothing inevitable about the Holocaust, nor is there anything inevitable about the genocides in the world today. The Shoah is a tragic example of what happens when people are ill-informed, indifferent, and inactive in the face of evil, when neighbor turned against neighbor because of their religion, and when the Western world refused to act because of prevailing anti-Semitism. Jews were expendable then, just as other religious minorities are in the 21st century genocides, although none of the magnitude, for sure, of the Holocaust. Hitler's initial goal was to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. Hitler proceeded carefully, waiting to judge German public and world reaction, and seeing none, he took one step after another, first passing racial laws, then isolating Jews, barring them from professions, destroying synagogues and businesses in Kristallnacht, expropriating their property and possessions, and then deporting them to concentration camps, finally murdering 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children. 2/3 of European Jewry, the flower of Jewish culture, religion, scholarship, and enterprise, and 1/3 of all Jews in the world. At the outbreak of World War II in 1939, there were 17 million Jews in a world of 2 billion. Today, there are only 14.7 million Jews in a world of 7 billion. The German people acquiesced or even supported seeing their neighbors dispossessed and deported, and the world failed to act, including the United States. Hitler got a clear signal and said so publicly that the world did not care about protecting the Jews, and he had a free hand to commit the worst genocide in world history. At the Avion Conference in July 1938, called by President Roosevelt to deal with the plight of German Jewish refugees, he sent low-level representatives and failed to take the lead in lifting rigid immigration quotas as an example to the rest of the world, while at the same time the State Department did all it could to restrict immigration. The SS St. Louis in May 1939, carrying over 900,000 German Jews, sat for days outside Miami and was not allowed to land. No sanctions were imposed on Germany before the U.S. finally entered the war. President Roosevelt had substantial evidence about the growing dimensions of the Holocaust, but failed to act, including a personal visit by the courageous Polish diplomat Jan Karski, who gave him and Justice Frankfurter his personal account of the Warsaw Ghetto. Because of the high levels of anti-Semitism in America at the time, for FDR did not want to make World War II seem like a war for the Jews. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times, gave his editors instructions to bury stories of the Holocaust, concerned his paper would be viewed as a Jewish paper. Nor did the American Jewish leadership do all they should have to pressure FDR to act more urgently on behalf of Europe's beleaguered Jews, likewise afraid of rising anti-Semitic sentiments. In the immediate post-war days, Nazi atrocities were revealed with the liberation of death camps and filmed at the insistence of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. While Americans were shocked by newsreels of the death camps, the staggering dimensions of the Shoah were not understood, and the Holocaust was quickly given a back seat as the focus of the U.S. and the West was the Cold War against the Soviet Union. There was little demand for justice beyond the Nuremberg trials of only a tiny fraction of the Nazi perpetrators. Jewish survivors were often poorly treated. Jews trying to reclaim their confiscated homes in Poland and Lithuania were killed, and post-war property restitution laws in countries like France, Austria, and the Netherlands were unsatisfactory. They lived in squalid displaced persons camps after the war. General George Patton, whose forces liberated concentration camps, ordered guards to monitor survivors as if they were inmates in prison. President Truman's representative on refugees, Earl Harrison, wrote him a scathing report after visiting the DP camps, and he said, "As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except we don't exterminate them. They're in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is left to wonder whether the Germans seeing this are not supposing that we're following or at least condoning Nazi policy." Great Britain kept 52,000 survivors trying to reach Palestine in squalid camps in Cyprus, some up to 5 years. Survivors rarely told their stories because they wanted to shield their children from the horrors through which they went and needed to focus on building a new life in the United States, Israel, or Europe. Authors like Elie Wiesel had difficulty finding publishers, in Elie's case for his book Night. In 1962, Rabbi Irving Greenberg was denied the opportunity to teach a course on the Holocaust at Yeshiva University because it was not considered a proper topic for academic study. But the monstrous dimensions of the Holocaust could not be hidden, although action to deal with its origins and consequences was slow and painful. In 1968, Arthur Morse published While 6 Million Died, a shocking description of what FDR knew about the genocide of the Jews and failed to act on. He was a colleague of mine on the Hubert Humphrey presidential campaign against Richard Nixon, and his revelations changed my life and committed me on a course to pursue Holocaust justice for survivors and memory for those who perished. A whole genre of books followed by major historians, and wider audiences were introduced to the Holocaust in 1978 by NBC's widely watched miniseries, Meryl Streep's film Sophie's Choice, Claude Lanzmann's classic 1985 9-hour documentary Shoah, and Steven Spielberg's Academy Award-winning 1993 Schindler's List. At last, the Holocaust seemed firmly embedded in the public consciousness, but it's now slipping over the decades. But beyond books and movies, the Holocaust created for the first time in the history of warfare a legal process by which a country which had abused and murdered its civilians, both its own citizens and those of countries it occupied, agreed to compensate survivors. In September 1951, the first post-war German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, accepted responsibility in his words for, quote, the unspeakable crimes that have been committed in the name of the German people, end quote. 1 month after Adenauer's speech, Dr. Nachum Goldman, president of the World Jewish Congress, convened a meeting in New York City of 23 major Jewish organizations, and speaking for the collective Jewish world, created the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference. Beginning in The Hague in 1952, March to be precise, negotiations commenced between Germany, led by Chancellor Adenauer, and the young state of Israel, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Beginning in The Hague in March 1952, negotiations commenced between Germany, led by Chancellor Adenauer, and the young state of Israel, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and parallel negotiations between the German government and the Claims Conference. In a historic agreement in Luxembourg on September 10, 1952, the Claims Conference and the West German federal government signed 2 protocols. One called for German laws that would compensate Nazi victims directly. The first post-war international agreement by the new German state was actually with Israel and a Jewish NGO and became embedded in domestic German law. The second protocol provided the Claims Conference with 450 million Deutschmarks for the relief, rehabilitation, and resettlement of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. These negotiations were so controversial that they took place under the cloak of secrecy. Menachem Begin and his Herut party led violent demonstrations outside the Knesset with a banner that read, "Our honor cannot be sold for money. Our blood shall not be atoned by goods. We shall wipe out the disgrace." After 3 days of emotional debate, the vote was very close. Only 61 of the 120 members voted in favor. Letter bombs were sent to the delegations. Nor was it easy on the German side. The major reason the agreement passed was the unswerving resolve of Chancellor Adenauer. His own CDU finance minister, Schaefer, was opposed, and some of his party voted against it in the Bundestag, while others abstained. It passed because every member of the Social Democrats supported it. The first major German Holocaust compensation program under the German federal indemnification laws, the BEG, provided lifetime pensions to a subset of survivors. It is critical to understand that today in 2021, there are around 350,000 Holocaust survivors around the world, of whom at least 50% are poor or near poor. 90% of those in the former Soviet Union and in Central and Eastern Europe, 35 to 40% in Israel, and around 30% in the United States. Germany has paid over $80 billion since the 1950s. Almost all of the major provisions the claims conference has negotiated with Germany go only to survivors in economic need. More than half of the 350,000 survivors receive some form of payment from the German government. The history of claims conference negotiations with Germany over the decades has been to expand the number of survivors eligible for payment as we tracked Germany's post-war history, a history of which post-war Germany can be proud. In 1980, the original role of the claims conference expanded with the creation of the Hardship Fund to provide direct one-time payments to Nazi victims who had received no prior compensation, and primarily benefiting those who had emigrated from the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Over the past 40 years, approximately 525,000 Jewish Nazi victims benefited from hardship payments, of whom around half remain alive. Many are from the former Soviet Union and fled almost certain murder by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen that followed the Wehrmacht in its eastern advances. I coined the term double victims of Nazism and communism, and they're often the poorest of Jewish victims. Beginning in 2009, I became the chief negotiator for the Claims Conference, along with Holocaust survivor Roman Kent and a negotiating team of survivors from the UK, Poland, Israel, and the US, brilliantly managed by Greg Schneider, Executive Vice President, Counsel Karen Heilig, and Rudy Malo in Berlin. Since then, we've obtained over $9 billion of additional benefits, especially in home care and increased pensions. In our September 2020 negotiations, we secured over 650 million euros for a supplemental hardship payment to the poor survivors. The next major development followed the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of the two Germanys. The U.S. government supported the Claims Conference demand for the compensation of Holocaust survivors, and this was incorporated into Article 2 of the implementation of the German Reunification Treaty of 1990, in which the German government was prepared to enter into agreements with the Claims Conference to provide payments to survivors who had thus far received no or only minimal compensation. After 16 months of difficult negotiations, the Article 2 Fund was established in 1992, providing a lifetime pension to those under certain income limits who were in camps, ghettos, or hiding for a prescribed period of time. Since 2009, we've negotiated liberalized criteria for the length of time in ghettos or living and hiding and covering open ghettos in several countries, including in North Africa, including an additional 18,000 survivors. In 1998, a similar pension program, the CEEF, was established in the former communist East Bloc countries. Over 135,000 survivors have been approved for pensions under these programs, and in 2021, over 50,000 survivors still receive Article 2 and CEF pensions. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany in 1990 led to another novel application of international law. The Claims Conference ensured, through German law, that former owners and heirs of property located in the former East Germany lost during the Nazi era were finally given the opportunity for restitution, the same as those who had property in the former West Germany. An equally novel agreement covered unclaimed or heirless Jewish property where whole families had been wiped out. Germany agreed that the Claims Conference would be designated as a successor organization. Rather than the property reverting to the German government, the Claims Conference became the owner on behalf of Jewish victims of the Shoah. This resulted in the recovery and sale of $2 billion for the Claims Conference, the vast majority of which has been used since 1995 for welfare programs to assist needy survivors worldwide. We're constantly seeking to enlarge the compensation programs. In 2014, the Child Survivor Fund was created and has paid over 80,000 child survivors a one-time payment of 2,500 euros In 2018, children who fled Germany and Austria on the Kindertransport were also entitled to a payment from this fund. We've expanded the number of additional groups eligible for the hardship fund as well. A second unique feature in international law occurred during the Clinton administration under my leadership, and that is payment by private companies for the harm they caused to civilians during World War II. The Holocaust was not only the greatest genocide in history, it was the greatest theft in history, only a small fraction of which has been recovered. After the collapse of communism, Edgar Bronfman, president of the World Jewish Congress and the World Jewish Restitution Organization, met with President Bill Clinton in the White House to urge that a special envoy be appointed to encourage the newly democratic countries in Central and Eastern Europe to return communal property, synagogues, schools, community centers, even cemeteries, to the shattered Jewish communities seeking to rebuild their communal life after the twin tragedies of the Holocaust and communism. I became that special envoy. Taking on a dual role while I was U.S. ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, I traveled widely throughout the length and breadth of the region to put the moral weight of the United States government behind this effort. In the midst of this work, I read a 1994 article in the Wall Street Journal about dormant Swiss bank accounts established by Jews seeking to put their assets away from the grasp of the Nazis in the most secure banks in neutral Europe, but never returned to their rightful owners and taken into the profits of the banks. I got permission from the State Department to pursue this injustice. When I met in Basel, Switzerland with the Swiss Bankers Association, I showed them the Wall Street Journal article, which had featured Greta Beer, a survivor who couldn't find her bank account of her father. And I asked for their response. Yes, they said, there were 730 accounts found after having an ombudsman review the records of all Swiss banks from 1933 to 1945. And they were going to pay the owners $30 million to take into account interest over the decades. A May 2nd, 1996 memorandum of understanding signed between Edgar Bronfman, the Jewish Agency of Israel, and the Swiss banks created an independent committee of eminent persons chaired by a former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, Paul Volcker, to conduct an independent audit of the wartime Swiss bank accounts. At the suggestion of the World Jewish Congress, Volcker retained an expert, Helen Ewens, to conduct a study of the pre-war Jewish wealth in Europe, which he estimated at $12.9 billion. After 3 years and more than $200 million in audit fees paid by the Swiss banks, the Volcker Committee issued its report, finding that some 54,000 accounts had probable or possible Jewish owners, and over 20,000 almost certainly did. The Swiss government remained uninvolved, putting the full burden on the private banks. I had led a 1997 interagency study showing that the government's central bank had helped finance the Nazi war effort by trading Swiss francs in return for gold they knew the Nazis had stolen from the coffers of the central banks of the countries they had overrun. Under the combined pressure of Edgar Bronfman, sensational Senate hearings chaired by Senator Al D'Amato of New York, class action lawsuits against the Swiss banks, my own mediation on behalf of President Clinton, and the critical intervention of U.S. District Court Judge Edward Corman, the Swiss banks agreed to a staggering settlement of $1.25 billion with a worldwide claims process. The Swiss bank settlement led to class action suits against German slave and forced labor companies who employed Jewish and non-Jewish workers, often working the Jewish workers to death, to which I mediated a settlement of $5 billion, 10 million Deutschmarks, in July 2000, which included $350 million for unpaid insurance policies. It was the first time Germany paid compensation to non-Jews, who actually got the majority of the funds. In January 2001, I mediated an $800 million settlement against Austrian companies with similar practices, along with $210 million to pay for the confiscation of Jewish private property, and then for French banks for also hiding Jewish accounts. Another novelty of international law was my negotiation in the Clinton administration with 42 countries in 1998 of the Washington Principles on Nazi confiscated art, establishing principles for the identification, publication, claims, and return of some of the 600,000 artworks the Nazis stole. The Washington Principles were amplified and broadened by the 47-nation Terezin Declaration, which I negotiated in 2009 in the Obama-Biden administration. Although not legally binding international law, their moral forces had a profound impact on the art world. 5 countries, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France, and the UK, have established claims commissions to adjudicate claims against public museums which hold these looted artworks. In 2018, the U.S. Congress passed the JUST Act, calling on the State Department to report on the implementation of the Terezin Declaration by its signatories, including the Netherlands, which it did in August 2020. Only a few weeks ago, a Dutch committee established by the Minister of Education, Science and Culture issued a stinging report critical of the process and policies employed by the Dutch Art Restitution Commission, perhaps leading to the resignation of its chairman. Thousands of paintings have been restituted or compensated due to the Washington Principles and Terezin Declaration. The 2 major art auction houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, have created full-time staffs to assure that they do not sell or auction Nazi-looted art, and Christie's has resolved over 100 claims. Monetary compensation or restitution are not the only ways to deal with victims of human rights and genocide. Another effective way is the creation of truth and reconciliation commissions, such as the one in South Africa, created by Nelson Mandela. These can avoid divisive retribution and lead to healing by giving victims a forum to describe their mistreatment. This was never done in post-war Germany. Holocaust education is now more critical than ever. During the initial post-war years, the Claims Conference was fundamental in providing critical funding for Yad Vashem, YIVO, Memorial de la Shoah in Paris, and the Wiener Library in London. The Claims Conference devoted a small part of the proceeds from heirless East German property for Holocaust education, research, and documentation. At its peak a few years ago, the Claims Conference was the single largest funder of Holocaust education, up to $18 million per year. But as the fund has dwindled, only a small fraction is available at the very time Holocaust awareness has dramatically dropped. In a major recent survey by the Claims Conference, 48% of American millennials and so-called Generation Z could not name a single one of the more than 40,000 concentration camps or ghettos established during World War II. 56% were unable to identify Auschwitz. 63% didn't know 6 million Jews were killed, and remarkably, 11% actually believed Jews caused the Holocaust. Roughly half have seen Holocaust denial or distortion posted on their social media platforms. However, the bright spot is that 64% felt that Holocaust education should be compulsory in their schools, and 80% believed it was important to learn about the Holocaust. In January 2000, then as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, I worked with the Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson, to establish the Holocaust Education Task Force to promote Holocaust education, then with only a handful of countries. But this has now become the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance with over 30 countries. However, in the United States, only about 12 states have any form of required Holocaust education. There is progress. In 2020, the U.S. Congress passed the Never Again Education Act to provide $10 million to provide and promote Holocaust education through grants to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In our September 2020 negotiations with the German government, concluded not long ago, they will provide the Claims Conference with 9 million euros in 2020, with an increase of 3 million euros each year, so there will be 18 million euros by 2023. Has the Holocaust taught the world anything? Are we any better for the lessons it should have given us? At one level, an argument can be made that we're repeating the mistakes of the Holocaust. After all, many acts of genocide and violations of human rights have occurred since the end of World War II. In Cambodia and Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, Darfur, Syria, Myanmar, China, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, and the list goes on without effective international intervention. But let me suggest that the world is slowly developing a set of international instruments that have the possibility of incorporating the lessons of the Holocaust, if combined with the will of the United States and our European allies. Let's look at how far we've come. Prior to World War II, individuals had no rights under international law and depended solely on how their nation, even Germany under Hitler, mistreated its citizens. No other state had a legal right to protest against the treatment of another state's abuse of its citizens within their territory, nor did individuals have a global forum to present their cases of mistreatment. This is not to say that nations were helpless to combat Hitler's mass murder of Jews, had they wished to do so. There's no question the Holocaust and the brutality of World War II has been a dramatic catalyst in improving the rights of individuals who now have internationally guaranteed rights and tribunals to assert them against states that violate them. But we always must be cognizant that these rights are fragile and depend heavily for their enforcement on other nations who act largely for their own interests. The Charter of the United Nations did not create an enforceable set of rights, given the strong opposition of the Soviet Union and the reservations of major Western allies, including the U.S. In order to get the U.S. Senate to ratify the UN Charter and avoid a repeat of the disastrous defeat of the Covenant of the League of Nations after World War I, the UN Charter had only vague language about promoting respect for human rights and fundamental freedom for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 adopted a non-binding UN resolution, which still remains a landmark. Since then, there have been numerous international agreements, such as the Genocide Convention, the International Covenants on Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, the Convention on the Rights of Children, the Convention Against Torture. In the early 1950s, the Council of Europe adopted the European Convention on Human Rights as a direct result of the Holocaust, which established the first organization allowing individuals the ability to sue states which violate their rights. The European Court of Human Rights, which remains active to this day, their judgments are largely honored. One expert, Thomas Bergenthal, has called the European Court the most effective international system for the protection of human rights in existence today. The International Court of Justice in The Hague was created in 1945 to be the principal civil court of the UN and to hear disputes between countries. In 2020, in a recent case brought by Gambia against Myanmar, the court issued a provisional decision aimed at protecting the Rohingya from further persecution under the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. Moreover, international criminal law and institutions to enforce it has also evolved. This began, of course, with the Nuremberg Tribunal to try Nazi war criminals. In 1993, the UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and several of the worst Serbian human rights offenders were tried and convicted, including Serb General Ratko Mladic. In 1994, the International Criminal Court for Rwanda was established following the Rwanda genocide. And in 2002, the International Criminal Court came into being, to which now over 120 nations, not unfortunately including the U.S., are parties. Radovan Karadzic, president of the Republic of Serbia, was convicted by the court, and 45 leaders, including Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, have been indicted by the court. There are other institutions today that did not exist during the Holocaust. Human rights NGOs like Human Rights Watch, Doctors Without Borders, HIAS, and Amnesty International highlight acts of genocide and war crimes. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's own Center for the Prevention of Genocide, to which I belong, thoroughly researches and works with members of the U.S. government to highlight areas where genocide is occurring or is at risk. The Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide has one of the largest education and training programs around the world to sensitize people to the dangers of genocide and mass atrocities through the lessons of the Holocaust. I chair the Defiant Requiem Foundation, which, with the vision of Murray Sidlin, has performed over 50 concert dramas in the U.S., Europe, and Israel, and increasingly in colleges and universities using student musicians and singers to dramatize the power of cultural resistance through the arts and music and giving people hope in a hopeless situation. We were scheduled to perform our landmark concert, Defiant Requiem Verdi at Theresen, in Amsterdam in May of 2020, which could have been broadcast nationwide on Dutch television. Because of COVID-19, this has been moved to 2021. The internet and digital communications and aggressive journalists can bring war crimes and acts of genocide directly into our homes to stir our conscience, something not possible during the Holocaust. For all its limitations, the United Nations, operating under a UN Security Council resolution since 1999, has numerous peacekeeping missions to protect civilians, providing some measure of protections Jews never had during the Holocaust. The limitations of international law, for sure, are all too painful. Nation-states are still the key drivers of the treatment of their citizens. International human rights are regularly violated by brutal autocrats around the world, with little ability of citizens to mobilize international law to protect themselves, unless it touches on the interests of Western and other nation-states. The U.S. and NATO, for example, intervened in Bosnia and then in Kosovo because the West in the end couldn't tolerate another genocide on its soil after the Holocaust. But many other massacres and genocides around the world do not capture the attention of the Western nations that could make a difference because they do not engage their strategic interests. A critical factor is the willingness of the President of the United States, along with the Congress, to make human rights a key part of American foreign policy. I'm proud that Jimmy Carter, who I served, was the first to do so, applying it to Latin American dictators, reducing their arms shipments, and using his bully pulpit to call for freedom and democracy in our hemisphere. Even while negotiating a nuclear arms agreement with the Soviet Union, President Carter championed the rights of Soviet Jews, leading to the doubling of Soviet Jewish immigration, and, by his own account, saving the life of Natan Sharansky from the false charge that he was a spy for the United States. Other presidents, from Nixon to Trump, give little attention to how nations treat their citizens and focus on their external conduct. I believe that President-elect Biden will put human rights back into a central role in his foreign policy. Of course, all presidents have to carefully balance American interests against human rights concerns, as in dealing, for example, with China. But making human rights at least a significant part of foreign policy can help advance this cause and protect vulnerable people from genocide. The Holocaust has been a stimulant in beginning to build a world in which human rights violations and genocide gained greater opprobrium. The most meaningful way to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is honored by the United Nations itself and dozens of other countries, including the United States and the Netherlands, is to pledge ourselves and to urge our governments to remember the lessons of the Holocaust and to take effective action against hate, anti-Semitism, human rights violations, and genocide, wherever it occurs and against whomever it is perpetrated. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you for letting me speak to you across the miles about my Holocaust memories. I want to extend my appreciation to Rabbi Shmuel Katzman for the privilege of sharing my story with you, and send warm greetings to Den Haag, a beautiful city close to my heart. Over the years, I've often come to The Hague, never without visiting dearest of friends who I consider family, Reinhold and Nanny Simon. In the late spring of 1945, less than a month after returning to Amsterdam from Bergen-Belsen and Tröbitz, and now almost 8 years old, Reinhold's parents invited me to stay for a few days in their lovely home in Deventer. I felt I'd been transported to a castle in a fairy tale. There were beautiful flowers on the table and wonderful things to eat. A bed that was clean and comfortable. There was light, there was warmth, there was beauty, there was tranquility, there was laughter. For me, it was nothing less than a magician at work after living for almost 2 years in a world of terror, filth, and death. These precious memories of Den Haag and Deventer remain clear and bright to this day. I had survived, and here was a glimpse of what life could be, filled with humanity rather than horror. Now let me quickly fill in some of the missing pieces. I must begin by saying I'm always reluctant to talk in public about my childhood experience in the Holocaust, how it was, and what it did. To this day, nothing I can say can do justice to what still remains to me as an unfathomable nightmare. My poor words can never sufficiently honor or grace the millions of children, mothers, fathers, and other innocents whose lives were so brutally cut short. Why did they die, and why did I survive? I have not and never will find an adequate answer to this painful question. And so it remains more comfortable for me to remember and honor those who were lost in a more personal way, and try to lead my life the best I can, always realizing I was blessed, I was saved. Not only was I saved, my whole family survived the Holocaust, my mother, my father, and my twin brother. According to available records, my brother and I are the only surviving twins of the Holocaust. In my heart and mind, my family's survival was nothing less than a miracle. And how do you really talk about a miracle and make it sound believable? My parents were born in Germany and tried to escape the growing stranglehold of Hitler by coming to Amsterdam in the fall of 1936. My brother and I were born in January 1938. In May of 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands. My parents tried valiantly to find some escape, England, Switzerland, but all doors were already closing. Going into hiding was not a very realistic option. At a time when silence was a prerequisite for not getting caught, housing 2 toddlers and their parents brought with it great risk. My parents investigated the possibility of finding a safe place for us, perhaps as far away as Indonesia, a separation they could not imagine. It was decided we would all stay together. Whatever was in store, we would endure it, hand in hand. Even though I was only 5 years old, I vividly remember the night we were picked up on July 23rd, 1943. I was both fascinated and terribly scared by the intruders and their uniforms, their shiny boots, buttons, and helmets, and particularly the sounds of those boots as they walked through our bedroom and living space. My parents had a tradition of each night putting candies in a Dutch shoe my brother and I kept at the end of our beds, sweets that we were always delighted to discover in the morning when we got up. As I was quickly getting dressed, I asked my mother whether I could take the candies in my shoe. The SS officer shouted at us to hurry, but as we left our apartment, my mother slipped the candies into my coat, a coat I would wear every day for the next year and a half. We were taken to Westerbork, and then 7 months later, on February 15th, 1944, deported to Bergen-Belsen, in cattle cars so full one could hardly breathe, and without food, water, or latrines. That awful day marked my parents' 10th wedding anniversary. Although Belsen was not an extermination camp, it was a living hell of death, starvation, constant beatings, and disease. Years later, I learned that the Nazis figured out with mathematical precision how long it would take for human beings to perish under hard labor and starvation. Just like the punctuality of the trains and the completeness of each and every list to the death camps, the Nazis kept their eyes constantly on their ultimate goal, the total extinction of European Jewry by a certain day. In Bergen-Belsen, the Nazis estimated that children could survive between 6 and 8 weeks. Now, sitting here at the ripe old age of 82, I can say my brother and I beat the odds. What else do I remember? My brother and I made up our own secret language. We call it hula flu. I will forever remember our 6th birthday, when my brother and I each received half a sandwich with butter and chocolate sprinkles, hagelslacht. It was our greatest birthday present ever. My brother and I ate a few crumbs every night, so the sandwich would last and last. My father had sold his wedding ring to make this wonderful gift possible. But there was also horrific memories, too awful to recall. My brother and I learned to count by tallying up the dead bodies piled up in front of our barrack each morning. It was only when I came to America that I realized that not everyone that dies is thrown in a pit like a discarded animal. In April of 1945, near the war's end, our family was put on what became known as the Lost Train, 50 cattle cars holding 2,500 sick and starving Jews. The train is undetected for 2 weeks and was finally liberated by Russian troops outside the village of Tröbitz in eastern Germany. 675 of its passengers died along the way and were left along the tracks. When there was time, there was a quick burial. It was at one of those burials along the tracks that I first heard the Shema Yisrael and Hatikva. The memory and tragedy of that setting still haunts me. We came to America in 1947. I was 9 years old, never had a day of school, but ready to start life anew. Before I close, I want to share with you 2 recent events that shed further light on my family's journey. A question that was never adequately answered for me was, how did our family end up in Bergen-Belsen when almost all families with young children were quickly dispatched to extermination camps, most of them to Auschwitz? Of the 103 trains that left Westerbork for the east, only 9 went to Bergen-Belsen, where there was at least some chance of survival. It was only 2 years ago that I discovered my family had obtained forged Paraguayan passports documents that surely helped save our lives, because Jews holding those passports were designated as potential exchange prisoners for Germans captured behind enemy lines. The champion of this story was a Polish diplomat, Konstantin Wukicki, who worked in the Polish consulate in Switzerland during the war and risked his life forging passports for Jews in Poland as well as in Belgium and Holland. It was only in 2018 that the list of those who were the beneficiaries of Wukicki's courage and humanity came to light. Wukicki died in a pauper's grave, but on October 10, 2018, at a ceremony in Bern, Switzerland, that I attended, he received his deserved hero's honors by the President of Poland. Another warm story, a delightful story, was in April, I wrote an essay on memories of the Holocaust as a young child and the world of COVID-19. And the essay was published on April 15th in the Los Angeles Times. In the article, there was a picture of my brother and I in Dutch costume. And someone saw the article, someone in California saw the article, and immediately recognized those costumes and was sure that they had come from a little fishing village in Holland, in central Holland, called Urk. We had had a wonderful nanny, a member of our family, and she always wore traditional costume and always wanted us to have such an outfit ourselves. And so she brought it to the house, and we had actually a famous photographer take those pictures. In any case, the war came, our nanny was no longer. We never remembered her name, and we never remembered actually the details of those Dutch costumes. But the person who read my op-ed piece contacted her family in Urk and discovered that our costumes had come from that very village and that our nanny had come from that village. There was a policeman in the town and also the local historian who within a week revealed to us all the places we had lived before the war, after the war, told us the name of the nanny, her family, and wonderful missing pieces of our puzzle. The pictures that, these pictures of the Dutch costumes were miraculously saved, and we received them after the war. So it always reveals to me that history moves on, and sometimes there are lovely aspects to a story of such great loss and horror. So in closing, I want to say, my life has been full and blessed in countless ways. I never go through a day without thinking about the miracle of our survival, the heroism of my parents, and having a twin brother, Stephen Hess, at my side. I live in gratitude, but always with the knowledge and also the burden that 6 million others did not have my luck and deserved the same grace. Thank you.
Please join me for a commemoration moment. My name is Sharon Zweit. I have the privilege of being the managing director of the Meester L.A. Visserhuis, the Jewish retirement home complex in The Hague. The Visserhuis honors the memory of one of the finest justices in the Netherlands, Lodewijk Ernst Visser, who was president of the Supreme Court of the Netherlands and was disgracefully laid off by the Nazis for being Jewish. The Visserhuis houses many survivors who experienced the horrors of World War II in one way or another. We do all we can to give these special people a good life, which they so certainly deserve. Today, 6 residents will light a candle. Together, they honor the memory of the 6 million victims of the Shoah.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the conclusion of this online event. The aim of our annual event is to remember and honor the victims of the Holocaust, which includes not only those 6 million Jews that were murdered, but also the survivors and their families, by discussing issues related to the Holocaust, the Shoah, and international law. This year, we chose to focus on restitution. It is not an easy topic, and over the years, it raised many controversies in Israel, Europe, and around the world. His Excellency, Ambassador Eisenstadt, touched upon these complexities in his important and educating lecture, when he elaborated about the controversies around what we call in Hebrew the Shilumim, the post-war German compensation to the survivors of the Holocaust. As Ambassador Eisenstadt mentioned, many of the Holocaust survivors still living among us are poor or close to that. The Holocaust, as other atrocities, has lifelong implications on its survivors, their families, and their communities in all areas of life, socially, mentally, and physically. We have a commitment to the victims. Restitution serves many purposes. It may help survivors in their struggles resulting from the horrors they suffered. It sometimes gives the victims a sense of rightfulness and closure, such as in the case of return of stolen artworks and other property. In addition to the individual compensation, there are efforts to ensure restoration on a communal level, such as efforts for the return of synagogues, cemeteries, and religious artifacts to their Jewish communities, which help protect also the cultural heritage of the survivors and the Jewish people. Most importantly, the discussion today touched upon the lessons learned from the Holocaust and the protection of individual rights that developed after World War II as part of its lessons. We all know that this is not enough, and more can be done. Sir Winston Churchill said, "A nation that forgets its past has no future." This phrase could also be applied to the international community as a whole. As His Excellency Ambassador Eisenstadt emphasized, there was nothing inevitable about the Holocaust. In order to guarantee a better, brighter future for our world, we need to enhance our efforts to educate about what happened in the Shoah. Continue the restitution efforts, fight anti-Semitism, learn from the past, and apply these lessons. I would like to thank His Excellency Abdulkawi Ahmed Yusuf, President of the International Court of Justice, for his willingness to yet again open the event and for his strong commitment and words. His Excellency Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt for his lecture, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for hosting its filming. The Honorable Jan van Zanen, Mayor of Den Haag, for his important words. Mrs. Marion Ein-Levin, for sharing her memories from the Holocaust with us. We know it was not easy, and we are very thankful for the opportunity to hear your memories as a Dutch girl during the Shoah with your twin brother. Your optimism, even after surviving such horrors, is a lesson to us all. I also wish to thank the members of the Jewish Old Age Home in Den Haag, many of them survivors of the Holocaust, who participated in the memorial ceremony. The Israeli embassy, including the legal team Avigail and Mirit, is proud to be part of the organizing team, and I would like to thank our partners who made this event possible. Rabbi Shmuel Katzman and the team of volunteers from Chai, the municipality of Den Haag, as well as to all others who have been involved in facilitating the online event. Thank you for joining us in commemoration of the Holocaust and its victims. I hope you all keep safe during these uneasy times, and that we will be able to hold a physical event in The Hague in 2022. Thank you.